to the DS Incubator. We are on the series about relational data. And last week, Miria asked a couple of questions about how to validate data. And that was super inspiring for me. I spent some time reading about the point blank package because I think that at least for the workflows that are more analyst oriented, they are the point blank package is kind of the right tool, for that job. And also today we have Faria, who you already used this package, right? Awesome. So I remember a mention of this a long time ago, and since then, by her, and since then I've been kind of thinking about this package. So I spent a little bit of time reading, or quite a bit of time reading the documentation, which is very extensive, which is great because whenever you need to do something, there is gonna be a good piece of documentation there. But on the other hand, it's quite challenging to digest. So hopefully this meetup will be a way to digest the things that at least I believe are the main features that add some value to at least my work, hopefully your work too. And I'm also going to comment like points where I prefer maybe other tools. So this image here shows an overview of the workflow that you can use with a point blank package that I believe is the most useful of all. It involves this function called create agent, which is an object, a special object that stores information about what you want to validate on a data set. So that agent takes a data set as an input. And then here in the middle, you can see a bunch of little things, or little validation functions that you can apply to your data. And the agent is gonna be recording them and doing nothing until you interrogate that agent. Only then the computations start, and you get as an output a report that will tell you if the things that you were expecting about the data are met or not, right? So that's the main workflow that I believe is the most useful. There is other workflows, and I'm gonna mention them later. So how that kind of translates to code. So that image was very useful to me to gain a very high level understanding of what that workflow is and can do. But here is a little piece of code, very small. So the first, because we're going to be using the point blank package, of course we need to attach it. So we do library point blank. And here I'm going to be using also the table package to create some toy data sets. These data sets, I've been using them in the last couple of meetups. So there's nothing special about them. It's just a demonstration with a very small example. So this data set has two tables, one that stores information about companies. These companies have an ID, which is unique in that table, and some information about them. For example, company number 1 with ID number 1 is called Alpha, and it sells solar panels and windmills. So if you try to find the same company in the second data set is called categories. Here in company ID number 1, you can see that it belongs to the sector energy. And it makes sense because it sells solar panels and windmills. So that's the structure of the data set. Two tables, two companies in the first one, three companies in the second one in the categories. And that is a problem that we're going to be using some of these validation functions today to kind of understand. So let's get to the validation. How can we write some code that helps us to validate that those tables and then create a report that is very easy to read and very easy to share also with stakeholders. And that's what I think is the most important value of the point blank package, that it's not useful only for someone like me who is developing code, but it's also useful for other stakeholders, analysts or managers that need to understand the data at a higher level, and they are not so interested in actually the code. They are more interested in the reports that I can produce with the code. So here's how it works. You may remember just from the image above. Let's scroll down back again. So there's like three main steps, right? Like the creating that agent, then applying any number of validation functions that you want to apply to that data, and then interrogating that agent so that you get some kind of intelligent information about it. So those three steps are now represented with this white space separating these 3 code blocks. So the first one is what you use to create an agent. So just in this case, I'm taking the dataset categories. I'm going to be working with it. And then I create the agent by calling the function create agent. And here I'm doing something that is beyond the default. I'm already doing a little bit of a tweak. I'm using this function action levels, which allow you to create a report that gives you a warning or something more severe than a warning when a certain number of conditions are not met. So if you have multiple rows, each row is a test for a specific condition that you want to validate, and you can say how many what's your threshold where after which you want to get a warning or you want to get a more severe stop message when some of those validation functions are not met. So first block, you create the agent. Second block, you start building your validation pipeline, right? And here you can use as many validation functions as you want, and there is a ton. There are basically 3 types. Here I'm using 2 types. So one type is those who start with call underscore vals. So basically you are looking for something about the values of specific columns. As such, you have an argument called columns, which is the argument that takes the name of the column in your data set, in this case, for example, company's ID, on which you want to apply that validation. This first one is fairly simple. So we are validating that the values of the column company's IDs are not null. Right? So that's a very common validation that you could do, for example, in the primary key of the dataset, and this is the case. The second function that I'm using here is a function that actually motivated the whole meetup. When I showed last time how to work with the DM package, with the data model package, Miria was asking, okay, how can you check, for example, if a table in the data model has values only within a specific set of values? Okay, so the point blank package has a specific function for that. This called vals in set. So it verifies that the values of the column, in this case, company's ID, is included in a limited subset of values. And here I used some code. Instead of hard coding the values, what I did is I wanted to check if the values of the ID column in the dataset categories are included in a set of values that is included in the unique values of the other table. So that is a check that you usually do on secondary keys, on foreign keys in databases, as that all the values of a foreign key exist in the primary key that is the parent of that foreign key, of that foreign table. So that is what this call is doing here. And then this other type, this one checks for the type. In this case, I'm checking that the column company's ID is of type numeric, for example. And this third one, this fourth one, is checking that the rows in all the columns of the categories table are all distinct, right? So what you do here totally depends on what you want to validate. This is, just a few, but it's a very long list of functions that you could use, and that is a very important value that this package provides to give you a very easy way to check quite complicated conditions that would take quite a bit more code if you want to do that kind of by hand. So we have an agent, we now have a plan, and now we pass that plan to the function interrogate, and the output of that is this interactive point-blank validation table that shows, you can see here in the steps that we chose. In this case, I used 4 steps. Each of the functions that I use are here. The columns that are being verified are there as well. Some values whenever that's relevant, like in this case, for example, I want to check if the values of the company ID were within 1 and 2, and so on and so forth. So here we have a report that tells us how many of those validation tests were we performed, and how many passed and how many failed. So here, for example, we have a failure in the column fail, we see 0, 0, 0 except for here. So this is the only one that failed. And we get an indication of that also by the little color here on the warning. And that comes from my having written this action levels call here. So I said that if there is one failure, then give me a warning. And that is the warning right there with that little dot. Then there was no like error, like no stop. That's why the column for stop is not kind of filled with red. And then the N stands for notify, which is an even softer type of message, and I have not included it. And then finally, we have a way to get a subset of the table that, for example, in this case, is the subset of data that does not meet this condition number 2. You can also see that the one that got the warning is highlighted in yellow here on the far left. So it's a very easy table to digest, even for someone who does not write code. So if I want to share this with my manager or with analysts in my team, they may not need to know what code I used to create this, but it's very easy to understand. And this CSV allows you to, this CSV button allows you to click there and automatically get to download the CSV file that contains only the rows that did not meet condition number 2, which allows me to then inspect that specifically to try and understand what's the root of the problem. So that is, I believe, the most important part of the package and also the most important part of this meetup, therefore. But there is more. So just to give you an idea of what else you can do. So the workflow that we cover here is the first one here to the top left, the data quality workflow, where you take a data set, also an agent, you create agent, remember we call the function create agent, and then we output a report. But then there is also another workflow that is identical, except for you are not using the agent, and you are not using also the function interrogate. All that you do is you pass the data directly through your validation functions that act in that way as a filter. So if any condition is not met, then the pipeline will basically stop. And the value of that is that if your data is meeting all the conditions, then the output of that is the exact same data that you inputted, but now validated. So it's a great way for someone like me who is writing production level tools to verify that all the requirements that I have for that dataset are met. And if they are met, then I have a data at the end of that pipeline that I can use. And if any of the requirements is not met, then I do not have data. What I have is instead a bunch of errors and warnings that I need to then understand deeper and fix, right? So that's workflow number 2. Then the other 2 workflows for the package are considered secondary workflows. Are basically each function that I show you with which you can validate something has 2 more cousins. One that allows you to create conditional code, one that returns true or false based on that condition, as opposed to returning messages or errors. You just get the true or the false. And then another cousin that is suitable to put inside unit tests when you are building packages. So those 2 are kind of nice to have, but honestly, I would maybe just use the lower level tools that come from more dedicated packages, like test that directly or just write vanilla code. So let me show you what that looks like. But your opinion may differ. You may use these functions, and surely in some cases they may be very useful. So here what I'm doing is the functions that I used before to validate the data. I'm wrapping them in a function called validate categories. That is for convenience in this, sorry for the background noise, for convenience in this demo, but also to kind of inspire you to collect those validation functions in a function itself that wraps them, so you can reuse them very easily once you understand what conditions must be met. And then instead of having the details of what those conditions are, you just have a name like validate categories that nicely hides all the implementation details of that validation. So now your main workflow, the data quality workflow, would become something like this. You just take the categories data set, you create an agent, then you call your validate categories, whatever that is that you decided with your team that has to be validated, and then you just call interrogate. The output should be very similar. Should be the same, except that in that function, I did something a little different, I think, for... Right, so here in create agent, I'm not passing the action levels. I'm not setting any threshold for warnings or stop messages and stuff. So in that is that it differs, but everything else is the same. But now the code is a lot more compact, and the output is very readable as it was before. So that's the workflow that you already know about, right? But let's have a quick overview of the other workflows that you can also do. The Etl workflows, basically the idea of something that you could do with when you're wrangling data, for example, or something that I would do when I take a data set, apply all the validations that I want, and if everything is fine, then I get a data set at the end, and if everything is not fine, then I get either a stop, my process stops somewhere and I have to fix the problem, or if the problem is not so severe, I may get a warning and then just know about that. So that's what I chose to do here. So I only got a warning, and that comes from here. So remember that I used the action levels before inside the call to create agent. You can also use action levels inside any of the validation functions that you can use. So in this case, I'm only validating, only creating an action for this one validation function. So for the other ones, I'm not. So this is just like a choice that I did for this, pretend that for this analysis, that's the only thing I want to get a warning for. And therefore, the warning here that you read here, right? That one here. Again, I'm reusing the validation functions all hidden behind this nice name, validate categories, and I have as an output, you can see here, the data set. So given the relatively low severity of the problem, I decided that it would be a warning only, and the data set would still be useful, so I do get a data set that I would include in a release of package or whatever that data set is going to be used for. And then the secondary workflows. So these are the workflows for which I particularly could use maybe some other tools. For example, for unit testing, let's start with a very simple data set here. Let's forget about the categories and companies data sets that I showed before. Let's now create a new data set called data with only one column, and that column is called X, and it has only one value. That value is the literal string 1, not the number 1. So with I told you that for every validation function like call is numeric, you also have a cousin that is a good fit for tests. So you can use the very common, very popular package test.dat to create tests. And then, if you don't know how to create tests, this might be a little maybe confusing, but if you are familiar with tests, then you will know that inside the test, at the end of each test, you have expectations. So you have to test if the expectation is met or not. So this is one expectation that comes specifically from the point blank package. So as I said, for every validation function, there is a cousin that starts with expect underscore, and it's a good fit for your tests. So this is what you would write, and if the test fails, this is the type of message that you would get, which is similar to what I showed here if I was using it in the other workflow for the ETL pipeline. And that's fine, except that I particularly prefer maybe in this particular case, because there's already a very common and simple function called isNumeric. I would do something like this. I would take the column directly, and I would just call isNumeric, and then I would pass that to expect true, which does not come from the point blank package. It comes from the test.package. In that sense, it's kind of lower level, and has less complexity before I get what I want, and I tend to prefer that. So the message is also, in my opinion, is cleaner, maybe because I'm used to working with test.dat directly, so I understand the error messages or the failures a lot easier. So this is the failure that I would get. And then the fourth type of workflow is that is suitable for what would be called conditional code or assertions. So basically, again, for every validation function, you have this cousin in this case that starts with test underscore, and it returns either true or false. So it's something that you could put inside an if clause, for example. If this is true, then do that. If it's false, then do something else. So this could be the use case of this function. But again, there is in base R, the function is numeric, so I would more likely use directly is numeric, and I get the same result. I guess it false here. Okay, so that is the core of the workflows, and I showed my opinion about what workflows I believe are amazing, what workflows are really good, but I could probably do something simpler. And now to end the meetup, I wanted to mention the idea of, okay, how do you gather requirements when you are not the only person that needs to decide what those requirements are? How do you communicate with your colleagues, with your managers, with your analysts if you are developing software? And the point blank package provides a really nice way to translate that agent object that you use to create a report. You can translate it to YAML, and there is a function called write. YAML write. So basically, it's the same workflow. You create an agent. The only thing you need to be careful about, you need to do this tilde thing because it's an expression, it's like a formula, it's not the object itself. That's the only kind of catch. Otherwise, it's the same thing. You create an agent with a data set, then you validate with as many validation functions you want, and then at the end, you instead of interrogating that agent, what you do is you do YAML write with the name of path. And that would write a file. I'm going to show you what that file looks like in our studio. That is basically captures all those steps in a way that is devoid of code. So if you want to communicate with your managers or your analysts, you may not want to confuse them with code. Instead, you may want something that is more like text, right? Like English, for example. So this is the output that comes from that call. So we have here type agent, the data set, the table is categories. We have the date, that's cool. So when we validated that, and here the steps are probably the most important thing because the functions that validate conditions are very readable. I believe they are pretty good names. I think it's also quite understandable for people that do not write code. And if they don't, then there is also a very good reference section for this package where you can point them to it and they can learn what these functions mean. So in this case, call values are not null for the column company's ID. In this other one, call values are in the set, and here the column that you are testing is company's ID, and the set that is allowed is number 1 and number 2, right? So I believe that that's pretty readable, and hopefully that will help you as an interface for communication between developers and analysts, or developers and managers, and so on, other stakeholders, to summarize. And then finally, I think that it's also possible, something that I'm thinking about and I may implement with my team, it's also possible to use what we call a data dictionary, which is very common in databases. One of these is here, where it's basically a spreadsheet, right, that you can share with your team, say with Google Sheets, for example, where you have all the data sets in your database. In this case, I have the data sets companies and the data set categories. And then each column in each of those data sets. So for example, the categories, which is the one that we have been kind of playing with, has the company's ID column and the sector column. And then a definition, so that's the minimum that you need for it to be a data dictionary, where you say, okay, for example, company's IDs is the identifier of each company. And then all these other columns here are what I think could be used as an interface for a communication of requirements between developers, analysts, and other stakeholders. Where you say, for example, the type of the column that you expect is a character as opposed to numeric or as opposed to a factor. You can also say, okay, do you need to enforce unique values? For some columns, you may need to do that. For example, for the company's data set, the company's ID column is a primary key in the as it's defined in traditional databases. And then here you can see that you can type, okay, it has to be it has to be true, right? So you have to enforce unique values for primary keys. And for other columns, it may not be the case. For example, the information column may not be unique, and that's fine, right? So this is one very succinct way and very readable way with a tool that has nothing to do with R, a tool that everyone knows how to use, just a spreadsheet, that you can use to, again, as an interface for communication of requirements between developers and the rest of the team. Okay, with that, I'm going to end the demo and go back to the meeting. Faria, are you still around? Great. I'd like to hear your thoughts about this meetup, or about your experience with the point blank package, or in general about gathering requirements and enforcing them with code, and basically your workflow when you work with data. Mm-hmm.
Output return with this object, it's like these functions. It's like these functions, but in a more user-friendly way.
Mm-hmm.
They can be run. So I liked seeing that. It was a cool demo. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Faria, for joining me today. I don't have first-hand experience, really. It's mostly something that I need to be working with soon, and that's why I'm learning about it by teaching it. So maybe, Faria, I'm gonna reach out to you later to share my experiences once I have them firsthand.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks a lot for joining me. See you next time.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.